welcome to Local Heroes. I'm starting this week in Yorkshire because all my heroes come from the north of England. This is the city of Leeds, which might have been the film capital of the world if my next hero hadn't mysteriously disappeared. Leeds Bridge, where I'm standing, was the first film location, and the first ever moving pictures were shot by Louis Le Prince. Louis-Aimé Augustin Le Prince was born in Metz in southern France. As a boy, he would often visit the studio of his dad's friend, Louis Daguerre, one of the pioneers of photography. In 1866, Le Prince married and settled in Leeds. Here he saw Edward Muybridge's photographs of galloping horses, taken with a row of separate still cameras. Muybridge animated his still pictures to look like movement, but Louis Le Prince wanted to go one better and capture motion pictures on a strip of film. This is the British Waterways building on Leeds Bridge. 100 years ago, it was Hicks the Ironmongers, and Le Prince came here to film Leeds Bridge because it was the busiest road in the city, and he wanted to capture as much movement as possible. Now this is the very room he used, and here is a replica of his camera. It's a beautiful beast. If you look round the front here, you can see the lenses. First, his viewing lens, his viewfinder, and second, his taking lens, the one he exposed the film through. And inside here, you can see his rotating shutter. Now, if you look through there, you can see as I turn round, a hole there comes up, and that, as that goes in front of the film, that exposes the film. But the really cunning bit was round the back. Louis realised it was no good just winding his film in front of the lens and having that hole come round, because if the film was always moving, every single image would be blurred. What he needed to do was to wind his film on and then stop it dead as the hole came round, and then he'd get a lovely sharp frame. And then he needed to wind the film on a bit and stop it dead again for the next frame. And that's what all the mechanism in here is designed to do. This is the spool of unexposed film. He used paper film. This is just paper to show you where it goes. And the film goes up behind that roller and then behind that complicated mechanism with steel springs. And that's actually the clamping mechanism. As you wind the film on, it clamps it down there, and then again there. And the film goes on behind that top roller and onto the take-up spool. And the take-up spool is driven by this wonky cog here, and you can see that goes round in a very eccentric way. That's so that it pulls the film along only when it is not clamped in front of the hole. So it goes on there like that. And now, this was the first camera and there was no standard film, but at least 35mm film does fit in it, so I'm going to load it up with this and take my own film of Leeds Bridge. But unfortunately, I need to load it in a darkroom. Now, this is the very window that Louis Le Prince used. I've got my camera more or less lined up. I'll just check the viewfinder, that's fine, and my focus. That's good, and it's just about on infinity. Now I just need to wait for a second to get a couple of buses in shot, because he wanted the maximum amount of traffic, and so I should do the same thing. Here we are, the light's gone green, they're just coming around the corner. 1, 2, 3, go! There, it's gone loose. I've used up all my film, and so all I need to do is to process it, and I can see what I've got. This is Broadcasting House, BBC North, and it was on this very site that Louis Le Prince had his workshop and projected the first moving pictures. I'm off to the Look North studio, the perfect place to project my pictures. Now, I've had my film processed and it looks fairly reasonable. I can see traffic lights and a bus, and what I need to do is to project a whole lot of these stills one after another on the wall, and then I'll have moving pictures. So I have to solve the same problem that Louis had to solve. He had to invent the projector. Here's my projector, and basically the same problem applies. You've got to move the film and then stop it so you can project that still image, and then move it again. And so I'm using precisely the same mechanism as I had in the camera. I need to wind about the same rate as I wound the camera. That's about it. And I can see a car moving. Oh, the lights have changed. And now, oh yeah, I've got a bus coming in shot. These are Le Prince's original pictures, taken with his camera from exactly the same window. You can see the buildings are still as they were, but in the last 100 years, horse and carriage has given way to car and bus. All over the world, people were trying to crack the problem of motion pictures, and Louis Le Prince had done it. He decided he needed to show his secret to the new world, and his wife got a special theatre ready in New York. But before he went over there, he had to settle some family business in France, and he went to Dijon. And on the 16th of September, 1890, he got on the 2:42 train for Paris, where his brother Albert waved him goodbye. And Louis Le Prince was never seen again. The middle of the 18th century saw the birth not only of the Industrial Revolution, but also, in this farmhouse near Barnsley, of a man who set the standards of engineering excellence for 100 years. He invented the best lavatory and the most unpickable locks, and he harnessed the power of water pressure. His name was Joseph Bramah. Joseph was expected to be a farmer, but he hurt his leg jumping at the annual feast at Bolton-on-Dearne. During his recovery, he took up woodworking. After 7 years as an apprentice to a cabinet maker, he decided to walk to London 170 miles to seek his fortune. What he actually found was a heaving mass of crime, poverty, squalor and filth. Bramah's contribution was his patent water closet, invented in 1778. It was clearly the best around, and he sold over 6,000 before the turn of the century. Flushed with success from the lavatory, Bramah turned to a new challenge, to build a better lock. I'm going to make a Bramah lock in the local pub, just up the road from his birthplace in Stainborough. Most of the locks at the time were ward locks, and I can show you a ward lock here. This is one. I'll just take the top off. I can show you how it works. Now the wards are actually these bits of brass here, and you have to have a key cut to a very funny shape to fit past them. Here we are. I'll put the key in there and you'll see those gaps in the key just fit over the wards so that it can then lock the lock. But the problem with the ward lock, it was easy to pick. Suppose you just took a flat bit of metal here and you put some wax on it and you put that carefully into the keyhole and then press it gently against the wards like that, and then take it out again, and on your key you would have a neat impression of the wards, and anyone could pick the lock. Now let me try and show you the principle of a Bramah lock. Here I've got a door held shut by a latch, and if I turn this barrel the latch opens and I can open the door. But if I can't turn the barrel, then I can't open the door. Here I've got a slider with a notch in it, and that slides into this groove here. It will engage with this fixed plate so the barrel won't turn. However, if I push it in until the notch lines up with the fixed plate, then I can turn the barrel and open the door. That really is the principle of the Bramah lock. Now in this particular lock there are 4 sliders, and if I line them up you'll see that the notches don't line up. In order to line up the notches, I have to move the sliders by varying amounts. And when I do that, then they will slide past a fixed plate. Now, let me show you how the Bramah lock works. I've used just 4 sliders, but Bramah used many more, because the more sliders he used, the more combinations there were, and the harder the lock was to pick. You have to imagine that the whole of this is encased in metal, so the only bit of the lock you can see is the outside end. And from there's no way of working out how to pick the lock, because each of those sliders has to be pushed in to a different extent, and you can't tell how much. Fortunately, I've got a key. This is the shank of the key, and you'll see that in the shank there are little slots cut to various different lengths.
and they're cut so that as you push them in, they will push the sliders to exactly the right amount to line up with that fixed plate. So I put my key in like that, and all 4 slots line up simultaneously, and now I can turn the key, turn the barrel, lift the latch and open the door. Just look at this beautiful Joseph Bramah commemorative lock. It's got 12 sliders, and it says on it, this lock requires 479,001,600 keys to open it under all its variations. And just listen, it's like oiled silk. A really beautiful lock, this. Joseph Bramah was so sure of himself and of the unpickability of his locks that he put in the window of his Piccadilly shop a padlock with a challenge offering 200 guineas to the artist who shall be able to find an instrument to pick this lock.
It was eventually picked 37 years after Bramah died by an American locksmith, Alfred Hobbs, who took 52 hours spread over 16 days. Bramah's inventive urges didn't end with the unpickable lock. In 1795 he made his most important breakthrough, hydraulics. Joseph Bramah realised a very clever thing, that you could multiply forces by using hydraulics. I've got one pipe here that's about 15 centimetres across, connected directly to this one here, which is about 3 centimetres across, and they're both full of water. If I push on the small piston, I put pressure on each square centimetre of water under it. This pressure must be the same for every square centimetre of water under the big piston, but it has 25 times as many square centimetres, so it's pushed up with 25 times the force. Of course, you can't get something for nothing, and you'll notice that I'm moving this pipe about 1 metre, and I'm only going up about 5 centimetres. Bramah realised that hydraulics could be used for more than just multiplying forces. His cunning beer engine used beer in the pipes instead of water. A weight on the big piston pumped the beer up to the bar. At the age of 65, Joseph Bramah was uprooting trees in the Ellis Holt forest with his hydraulic tree puller, but it was an icy cold day. He caught pneumonia and died. He was a truly brilliant engineer, and to this day, in Yorkshire at least, a beautiful piece of machinery is still called a real Bramah. For the last 100 years, most serious science has been done in major institutions like universities, and very often by teams of people. But just occasionally there's space for the gifted amateur, the person doing science just in spare time. This is Stonegate, one of the ancient streets of York. And 100 years ago it was the home of a man, as he described it, of limited leisure, who nevertheless travelled the world studying volcanoes and coming back with amazing photographs and stories. His name, appropriately enough, was Tempest Anderson. Anderson was an eye surgeon and a keen photographer in search of a scientific pursuit to make the best use of his picture-taking skills. He decided to study volcanoes because, he said, it offered exercise in the open air, often in districts remote and picturesque. So from 1883 he always kept 2 suitcases ready packed, one full of tropical gear and the other with winter woolies, just in case he heard about a volcano and he wanted to leave at a moment's notice. Tempest took his camera with him wherever he went, and he brought back the most amazing photographs. Here are some of them, and the detail in these pictures is terrific. He took with him apparently a great entourage of young ladies, a lady with a parasol standing in front of a fumarole, and here's some women playing cricket on board ship. There was a serious side to his work as well. In 1902, Anderson photographed the town of Saint-Pierre in Martinique, just after the eruption of Mont Pelée. Volcanic deposits up to 200 feet thick smothered the surrounding valleys, but strangely, in the devastated town, there were no signs of lava flows, just a light sprinkling of dust and ash. This reminded him of something he'd seen in the Alps. He was a keen member of the Alpine Club, and there he'd seen trees felled by avalanches, but not covered with snow.
and he realised that the trees must be knocked over not by a huge rush of snow, but by a hurricane-force wind generated by the avalanche. He thought the same thing might have happened with the volcano on Martinique. Anderson reckoned that what must be happening was when the volcano went up, there was a huge column of red-hot gas and boulders and sand and dust going absolutely straight up into the air, and then it hung there poised for a minute and then collapses and rushes down the sides of the mountain in what he called a ground surge. I'm going to make my own ground surge in a water tank to slow things down a bit so we can see what happens. I'm using fine grinding powder to represent the dust, rocks and ash, and coloured methylated spirits for the swirling hot gases. The extraordinary thing about that mixture of red-hot gas and dust and rock is that although it's a mixture of gas and solid, it behaves like a liquid. When I lift the sluice, the methylated spirits, my swirling hot gases, rush out like the winds of an avalanche, devastating the little wooden mountainsides. This hot swirling ground surge is now called pyroclastic flow. Let's have another look. The heaviest rocks and ash fall out of the mixture and are deposited on the ground. Turbulence keeps the smallest bits of ash and dust in the billowing pyroclastic flow as it rushes along at hurricane speeds, destroying all before it, but leaving only a little ash in its wake. This is just what happened at Saint-Pierre. The entire town was demolished in 2 minutes, killing 29,000 people, and the only survivor was a prisoner locked up in an underground cell. Tempest Anderson risked life and limb on every one of his expeditions. A friend once said, "You know, Anderson, you're bound to die, but it will be such a very great satisfaction to you afterwards that it was in the cause of science." Unfortunately, Tempest didn't go out with a bang. He died from a fever on the way back from Java.
Tempest Anderson was one of the last great amateur scientists, but perhaps we've missed some. If you know of any great amateur scientists who might make local heroes, why don't you write and tell me about them? This was the gatehouse to Austhorpe Lodge, a posh place on the edge of Leeds and the birthplace of a truly scientific engineer. A man who designed bridges, dug canals, investigated water wheels and built a famous lighthouse. His name was John Smeaton. John Smeaton was the son of a Leeds solicitor, but by the age of 16, to his father's dismay, he was hooked on mechanics. Smeaton's engineering rise was meteoric. Although he had little experience, in 1756 he was given the mammoth task of building a lighthouse on the Eddystone Rocks. It ended up lasting longer than the rock it stood on, which started to crumble in 1876, 127 years after Smeaton finished building it. I've come to Thwaite Mills, an 18th century chalk mill just south of Leeds. During the winter months, when he couldn't work on the Eddystone Lighthouse, he started other engineering projects, like building canals, in particular the Calder and Hebble navigation. And he also set about the scientific investigation of water wheels. He looked at two basic types of water wheel. In the overshot wheel, water comes to the top of the wheel, and there are buckets attached to the end of the wheel here, and the water fills the buckets, and the weight of the water in the buckets pulls the wheel round. In the undershot wheel, the water comes right underneath the wheel, and at the bottom, the vanes or paddles stick out from the wheel, and they're pushed round by the force of the water. The big question was, which sort of water wheel was the most efficient? They all had their champions. Monsieur Bélidor said that the undershot wheel was 6 times as efficient as the overshot wheel. On the other hand, Monsieur Desaguliers, a very famous chap, said that the overshot wheel was 10 times as efficient as the undershot wheel. Now clearly one of them was wrong, but which one? John Smeaton decided the only way to find out was to test water wheels scientifically.
He built a small test rig with a water wheel that lifted a weight. He made many trials with various flow rates for both overshot and undershot wheels.
Now, I've built my own rig to do my own experiment. I've got two identical water wheels here. One of them is overshot, this one. Look, if I let water in here, it comes over the top, it pushes the wheel round just by the weight of the water. And this one is undershot, the water comes down the back, and if I open it up, it'll push the wheel round by the water going underneath it. Okay, so they're both going round together, and just to see how effective they are, I've connected each one to a massive weight, which you'll see is just on the ground there. And you'll see that the strings to which they're attached go over pulleys and round the axles of the wheels. So as the wheels spin, they will wind up those massive weights, and we want to see which one winds it up faster. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that I've got two reservoirs which are identical, they're both full and at the same height. There are identical lengths of hose pipe coming down here of the same diameter, so it should be the same flow of water. So with luck, we can see at once which water wheel is the more efficient. Okay, I'm going to switch them on. The undershot's having some trouble moving. No, it's going now. And it looks to me as if the overshot is going faster. Now, Smeaton himself did hundreds and hundreds of tests. In fact, he went ahead and built full-scale water wheels to check out his results. And he didn't publish them for 7 years. And then he found the overshot is twice as efficient as the undershot. And look, my overshot's won. Now I've got to turn off the water quickly. And you can see that actually that's pulled all the way up, and this is only about halfway. So my conclusion, extraordinarily, is just about the same as John Smeaton's, that the overshot wheel is about twice as efficient as the undershot.
I wanted to visit St Mary's Church in Whitkirk, where Smeaton was buried in 1792. John Smeaton was a founding member of the Society of Engineers, which came to be called the Smeatonian Society. He was undoubtedly one of the first really scientific engineers. As he said himself, the construction of mills as to their power is with me not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of calculation.
It's not often I get a chance to drive an old steam engine, but this isn't just any old steam engine. This is a replica of one of the most famous steam engines of all time, the Rocket, built in 1829 by George Stephenson, with a bit of help from his son Robert.
George Stephenson was the second of 6 children. He had no formal education, learning to read and write at evening classes when he was 17. He'd spent most of his childhood at the colliery with his dad, who was fireman at Wylam Pit.
In the late 18th century, this was a wooden tramway. The pit was back there in Wylam, and horses used to trudge along here carrying the coals to Newcastle. And right beside the tramway was this house, where George Stephenson was born and raised. He was interested in engines and mechanical things, and he became in succession engine man, brakesman and engine wright. And in 1813 he was asked to build a steam locomotive at Killingworth. George Stephenson didn't invent the railway locomotive. The first one had been built by Richard Trevithick, the fiery Cornishman, about 10 years earlier. But he did at least get them on the right lines, literally, because George insisted that they should use wrought iron for the rails, which was much tougher than cast iron, and it stood the weight of the engine.
By 1825, George and his son Robert had laid out the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the first to carry passengers. It used a combination of horses and steam locomotives to pull the carriages. But it was the Liverpool-Manchester Railway that was the turning point in the history of steam trains. Though the line was already under construction, by 1829 they still hadn't decided how to pull the carriages. there would be far too much traffic to use horses, and although stationary steam engines pulling the carriages with cables seemed to be the answer, George argued passionately for the steam locomotive. The question was, which was the best locomotive in the land? To find out, they held the Rainhill Trials, and it was for the Rainhill Trials that George and Robert Stephenson built the Rocket. Now, what made the Rocket different, and indeed better than its rivals, was the design of the boiler. This is the boiler here. And the particular thing was these pipes. There are 30 of these pipes, 3 inches in diameter, running from one end of the boiler to the other. And what they did was to carry the gases, the hot gases from the firebox here, through the boiler to the bottom of the chimney here. And as a result of having all these many pipes, you've got an enormous surface area to transfer the heat very efficiently from the hot gases to the water in the boiler. The result of this was that the Rocket was much more efficient than its rivals, and it easily won the Rainhill Trials. And this is it, the real thing, the original Rocket. It was this locomotive that won the Rainhill Trials in 1829. Absolutely fantastic. The driving wheels and the cylinders. I mean, to touch such a piece of machinery is a real privilege. On the 15th of September 1830, she actually pulled the first passenger train from Liverpool to Manchester, pulled passengers along at 30 miles an hour and brought in the age of the steam railways. You might think that building the world's fastest train would be the pinnacle of one's career, but George still had one or two things to straighten out. When George Stephenson came to the end of his line, he retired to Chesterfield, and there at Tapton House he became an enthusiastic horticulturalist. He also tried to grow straight cucumbers. He found it was very difficult. He tried giving them more sunlight or less sunlight or turning them around, and in the end the only thing that worked was this, the cucumber glass. He invented it in the 1840s, and here's how it worked. When he had a little cucumber, he poked it in the end, and then it had to grow straight inside the glass, and this is one of George Stephenson's own cucumber glasses. With this glass he brilliantly anticipated a 1988 EC regulation number 1677 on the common standards of quality for cucumbers. Section 2 quality, subsection B classification, extra class and class 1, maximum height of arc 10 millimeters for every 10 centimeters of length. So this one's obviously out the window. So I'd like to raise a glass to George Stephenson, the man who not only built the Rocket, but also invented the straight cucumber. I'm sorry, that's all the heroes we've got time for. See you next time! If you want to tell me about amateur science, have a look at the Local Heroes website at www.bbc.co.uk/education, which also has our email address. Or write to me at Local Heroes, BBC 201 Wood Lane, London W12 7TS.